Cool Air by H.P. Lovecraft is a weirdly un-Lovecraftian story. It's about a scientist who discovers that by keeping his apartment incredibly cool at all times with this cooling mechanism, he can artificially elongate his life. At the end of the story, the cooling system fails, and the old man melts. And that's pretty much it. There's no ancient creatures worshipped as gods, no sense of a godless universe filled with incomprehensible horrors. It's just a story about a man who turns into goo. It's about a gooey goo man. Despite this, there's been a surprising number of adaptations of Cool Air. There's Albert Pune's 2006 film, there's multiple TV versions, and then there's this one, a segment in the 1993 Lovecraft anthology Necronomicon. Necronomicon was created by Brian Yuzna and was a co-production with several Japanese connections he'd made in the previous years. In particular, it seems like a lot of the money came from what was then Pioneer, the company that would eventually become Geneon. So the movie is based around this frame story in which H.P. Lovecraft reads the Necronomicon, and then there's 3 segments within that. The Cool Air segment is the most interesting to my sensibilities because despite being shot in America with a largely American cast, the directing and writing were actually both Japanese. It was directed by Shusuke Kaneko and written by Kazunori Ito. Ito has actually not written a lot of live-action films. He's mostly an anime screenwriter. At the time, he was really Mamoru Oshii's main creative partner. He provided the screenplay for both Patlabor movies, The Red Spectacles. He would go on to write the first Ghost in the Shell film. He's also the main creative force behind the Dot Hack franchise, so he's an interesting figure. The director, Shusuke Kaneko, is actually someone I've been really hyper-fixated on lately. This is largely because I watched his adaptation of the BL manga Heart of Thomas, which is a really great film. It's called Summer Vacation 1999, but confusingly it came out in 1988. It's got this really ethereal, ghostly vibe. It uses an all-female cast to capture the androgyny of early BL manga. It's really cool, I'd recommend it. But he actually began his career directing pink films, including an Aim for the Ace parody and a live-action adaptation of Mene Agachao. He's a pretty mainstream director now. He seems to do a lot of anime adaptations into live-action. He directed those 2 Death Note movies. Not the Netflix ones, obviously, the Japanese ones, with the soundtrack by Red Hot Chili Peppers. Anyway, Ito and Kaneko's segment is pretty fun. Out of all the segments in this film, it's the most faithful to the original text it's adapting. The designing and costuming has this interesting timeless quality too, where it sort of feels like the 20s and the 70s at the same time, and it definitely delivers on the story's main pleasure, which is getting to see a gooey goo man. This is probably a good time to mention that the special effects are by Screaming Mad George, and it's right in that period where he was just constantly producing non-stop seminal works. You know, fitting these like Dali-esque absurdist masterpieces into everything he was working on. This film is all kind of leading to this really big animatronic melting zombie body, and yeah, it's worth seeing. Lovecraft is obviously a very conceptual horror writer, but I think the cool thing about George working on it is he brings a tactility to that horror that manages to be physical while still feeling unspeakable. Can I just say too how much I love that while he was making this stuff, he literally looked like a 90s Bishonen. Amazing. In a lot of ways, this segment is super silly, but not in a way that I think harms the enjoyment. I mean, if you're going to watch a movie about a goo man, you should be prepared for some hammy line deliveries.
Lena's very protective over you. Are you in love with her?
Director Kaneko is definitely capable of channeling amazing performances. The young cast of Summer Vacation are really understated and subtle, for instance, but as I understand it, he didn't speak English while making this, and the cast here often have that energy of really not knowing what tone to strike.
Unfortunately, the air conditioning unit in this building is old and prone to break down on hot days such as this one.
To be honest though, I think seeing these mostly quite good actors turn in soap opera style line deliveries is totally part of the joy of this experience. If you watch this movie, you will see thespian David Warner look very lost, and it will be a good time. In a sense, I think this segment works because it doesn't really try to tackle the more unadaptable elements of Lovecraft. It's not overly ambitious in that way. It's mostly down to tell an effective little body horror story, and that's what it does. Visceral and fun and campy, it's a good time. Weirdly, there's also kind of an anime connection in the movie's previous segment, The Drowned. This is sort of a shadow over Innsmouthy fish people thing, and it was the first professional film directed by French director Christoph Gans. What's interesting to me about that is that Christoph Gans has actually kind of created a career of translating Japanese anime and video games into live action. He's kind of a French parallel to Kaneko in that way. Honestly, we stan a French weeb, but they are the most powerful form Right after this movie, he would team up with Brian Usna again, this time to direct an adaptation of the Koike manga Crying Freeman. He would later direct the Silent Hill film, but most interesting for our purposes is that after finishing Freeman, he was offered several Japanese media projects to work on. He was offered titles like Battle Angel Alita and Midnight Eye Goku, but he chose Patlabor. And honestly, taste. Like, goddamn, Christoph Gans, nice. Obviously, this never ended up getting made, but yeah, wow. What would an American Patlabor movie from the 90s have been like? I feel like the culture would not have been ready, but I would have loved to have seen it. Now, I don't want to dig up Gans just to bury him, but I do have to mention that I've never fully gotten along with his work. Though watching this segment, you can definitely see why it'd be a good choice to direct a video game and anime adaptations, in that he's able to create very, very silly and stylized images, while still making them feel somewhat believable and weighty. In fact, the final set piece of this segment has the main character cutting the ropes on a chandelier so that it'll fall into a big fish monster, and it definitely feels like a video game boss, but it also works. It's pretty dramatic and engaging. Also, the fish monster designs are very rubbery and tokusatsu-like, but they're also really cool, and he shoots them in moody lighting with dramatic mist, so it all feels very evocative. Gans is one of those directors who always seems to have multiple projects in development hell, and he doesn't seem to get that much made as a result. And I do think that's a shame, because while he's not my cup of tea, he does seem to be someone who can take really high concept visuals and make them work on a pretty low budget. So yeah, visually, this really works for me. It's basically, you know, the closest we've gotten to a live action Shadow over Innsmouth, at least visually. Narratively, it doesn't really work for me as much. Speaking to the magazine Cine Fantastique about the themes of his segment, Gans said, "My interest in Lovecraft is the mythology, which is not Christian. There is no hell, no heaven. There is no idea of sin. There is only the idea that there is something beyond dreams, beyond reality. I like that. My own explanation for his success to date is that he anticipated many things like the post-acid culture and new age culture about dreams and the other side of reality." And this is a cool quote, which shows that he understands Lovecraftian themes. I just don't think they're actually reflected in the film itself. The story of this movie is about this guy whose wife and son dies, and so he renounces God and resurrects them as demonic fishmen, which doesn't really feel like cosmic horror to me. That feels much more reminiscent of Christian Gothic stories, where you return to paganism with disastrous consequences. Probably not the intent, it just doesn't seem to really capture that Lovecraftian feeling to me, beyond the basic visuals.
I bet he didn't tell you the butcher's an alien.
Oh, what?
Oh, yeah. He's been down here since before the dinosaurs, if you can believe it.
Definitely the most Lovecraftian segment, without a doubt, is Brian Usna's Whispers. In fact, this is a lot truer to the author's themes than most adaptations I've seen. It's this dreamlike story about a policewoman trying to find a serial killer known as the Butcher. It's sort of like a mix between an Abel Ferrara crime movie and a Lovecraftian short story, and it's just as intense as that sounds. Throughout the story, the protagonist is guided by these spooky characters who speak in a mishmash of Lovecraftian ideas.
People used to pass through this tunnel, just like we're doing now. But they didn't believe in no God, did they?
They kind of function as mouthpieces for Lovecraftian ideology. Part of why this segment is genuinely unsettling and unnerving, in a way I don't think the others are, is that it keeps the nature of its threat very ambiguous. It really captures that cosmic horror feeling of monsters that aren't fully defined. They might be elder gods, or strange ancient aliens worshipped as gods, and there's this resulting sense of a totally amoral, chaotic universe. It also climaxes in this really horrific, reality-bending, fleshy nightmare. I think the conclusion of the piece, where it starts depicting the creatures, it does a really good job of maintaining those ambiguous themes, while also providing a way to visualize cosmic alien horror. In interviews, Usna has framed his work as an attempt to get back to that initial feeling of horror one gets as a child. In a conversation with Bailey J, he stated,
"But there are some people like myself who kind of never lost that adolescent obsession with horror. And I think most of the people I know like that, which are most of my friends really, they can pretty much trace their interest back to a kind of a traumatic horror movie experience
Right.
when they're very young. It's almost like a drug in that, the first time it makes you sick, and then from then on, you're just sort of trying to recapture that feeling. Then I think as you get older, you're just sort of chasing the dragon. You kind of you just want to capture it again. And it's hard to, because by the time you get older, you don't really, it doesn't work the way it used to. You're not immersed in it, and you start appreciating it more from the aesthetic and historical and the more formal parts of it.
I think something he hits upon here is how much harder it is to be scared once you know the way in which a genre is codified. This is one of the reasons I like the way in which this segment doesn't fully outline the mythology of its creatures. It only gives fragmentary hints and suggestions to their true nature. We're not sure if they're ancient aliens or demons or what exactly their purpose is. In contrast, I find it really hard to find, say, Cthulhu scary at this point. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Cthulhu, excellent kaiju design, I'd love to see him fight Godzilla, but he's too defined in my mind to really find him scary anymore. He more resides in my consciousness as an interesting kaiju design at this point, rather than a genuinely unnerving unknown. Whereas in this movie, we get bits and pieces of what the Butcher is, and the horrible things it does, and the way it can seemingly bend reality, but we don't quite know what it all adds up to, and that shit is really scary. However, while it's very effective, I also enjoy this segment the least, largely just because I'm kind of a baby, and this has a lot of torture in it, and I'll be real, I just don't like torture in movies. Not for any moral reason, it just really unnerves me and makes me feel bad, and I don't like seeing it. But that's the segment's credit. It's probably the most effective as a horror piece. But yeah, I would recommend this movie. It's one of the many strange, interesting examples of Japan-related Lovecraft works. Almost as interesting as Nyaruku-san, the story of ancient being Nyarlathotep as a 2000s moe girl. Entertainment! But yeah, cool stuff. Check it out. Or don't. I don't know. It's up to you.
Consider your privileges revoked, Mr. Lovecraft.
Man, movies used to be better.